In 1960, France detonated a nuclear bomb nearly 5 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. But here's what most people don't know. It was conducted in the Sahara Desert of colonial Algeria. President Charles de Gaulle returned to power in 1958 with a clear mission. He refused to accept France's reduced status. De Gaulle believed that nations without nuclear weapons would become irrelevant in international affairs. He watched how nuclear powers got respect at the negotiating table while non-nuclear countries were ignored. The message was clear. If France wanted a seat at the table where important decisions were made, they needed their own nuclear weapons. The French government kept the nuclear program secret from both allies and citizens. When officials had earlier considered testing nuclear weapons on French soil, protests erupted in Corsica in 1959 and 1960, forcing them to abandon those plans. American officials warned that a separate French deterrent could destabilize alliances, but French military leaders argued that depending on American protection was unrealistic. Would the United States really risk nuclear war with the Soviet Union to defend French interests? French generals doubted it. Building nuclear weapons from scratch required massive resources. France had to build its entire nuclear weapons complex from the ground up. Research reactors, plutonium separation facilities, and warhead design labs under de Gaulle's Force de Frappe program. American and British scientists shared information with each other, but they excluded France from their nuclear cooperation agreements. But having nuclear weapons was only half the battle. France still needed to test their bomb to prove it worked and to understand its effects. This meant France needed a testing site somewhere far from populated areas and prying eyes. The search for a testing location would lead France to make a decision that created consequences lasting decades. The choice they made would connect France's nuclear program permanently with the painful history of decolonization and create disputes about responsibility that continue today. France's original plan for testing their nuclear bomb was much simpler. They wanted to detonate it in an abandoned mine on the island of Corsica. This location seemed practical because it was French territory, but news of the Corsican testing plan leaked to the public. Massive local demonstrations, even in Italy, forced officials to drop Corsica. The opposition was so strong that French officials had to abandon their Corsican plans completely. The French government needed a new location fast. They looked at their colonial territories and found what seemed like the perfect solution. The Sahara Desert in Algeria was vast, remote, and sparsely populated. Most importantly, France had complete military control over the region during the ongoing Algerian War. French commanders could operate there without worrying about local protests or international interference. Under a confidential clause of the 1962 Avion Accords, France kept the right to use Sahara sites for 5 more years, guaranteeing its testing window. French scientists and military planners convinced themselves that the desert would contain any radioactive fallout. They believed the remote location would keep the radiation effects limited to a small area. This assumption proved to be completely wrong. French officials had limited understanding of how nuclear explosions actually behaved in desert conditions. They underestimated how far radioactive particles could travel through the atmosphere. Timing played a crucial role in France's decision. Algeria was moving toward independence, and French control over the territory wouldn't last forever. Independence negotiations were already happening in Paris. French officials knew they had a narrow window of opportunity. If they waited too long, they might lose access to their preferred testing site. This created pressure to move forward with the nuclear program quickly. The Tuareg and Arab communities living in these desert regions were never consulted about turning their homeland into a nuclear testing ground. These communities had lived in these areas for centuries, following traditional migration routes and grazing their animals. Most local people weren't even told what was being planned for their territory. Many would later suffer from congenital disabilities and other health problems they never understood were connected to the nuclear experiments. French military engineers established the Saharan Military Experiments Center near the town of Regan. They built roads, facilities, and housing for thousands of personnel. Workers constructed observation posts instrument stations, and command centers. Most of the French soldiers and technicians brought to the site didn't know the true purpose of their mission. Military commanders kept the nuclear testing plans secret, even from their own people. International opposition was growing stronger. African leaders recognized the danger these tests posed to their continent. They formed the Sahara Protest Team in 1959 to organize resistance against French nuclear testing. Despite these international objections, France decided to press forward with their nuclear program. The French government ignored the protests and warnings. They were determined to join the nuclear club regardless of the consequences. French officials believed that having nuclear weapons was more important than addressing the concerns of African populations or international critics. But before the devastating test itself, France had to give their nuclear weapon a name. While the United States chose intimidating names like Trinity for their nuclear tests, and the Soviet Union used technical codes like RDS-1, France made a completely different choice. They decided to call their first nuclear bomb Gerboise Bleu, which translates to Blue Jerboa in English. This name seemed almost playful for such a destructive weapon, but the choice actually revealed important details about how French officials thought about their nuclear program. A jerboa is a small desert rodent that lives in the Sahara Desert. These creatures are known for their ability to jump long distances and survive in extremely harsh conditions. French planners chose this animal because it was native to the exact location where they planned to test their bomb. The jerboa represented something that could thrive in the desert environment, where France would conduct their nuclear experiments. The blue part of the name connected the weapon directly to French national identity. Blue is the first color of the French flag, and French officials wanted to link their nuclear program to national pride. They saw the bomb as a symbol of French strength and independence on the world stage. Using the national color made the weapon feel like a patriotic achievement rather than just a military project. The jerboa's survival abilities may have appealed to French planners for symbolic reasons. These small animals can live in extreme desert heat and find water in the harshest conditions. French officials hoped their nuclear program would similarly survive the harsh criticism they expected from other countries. They wanted their nuclear weapons to endure international pressure, just like jerboas endure desert conditions. Subsequent tests used gerboise plus color codes, blanche, rouge, verte, to maintain secrecy. These color codes allowed French officials to organize and discuss their nuclear tests, while maintaining operational security about the program's true scope. The choice to name the bomb after a local desert creature showed how France viewed Algeria during this period. French officials treated the Sahara Desert as their personal laboratory, using local wildlife as symbols for their nuclear ambitions. They took a creature that belonged to the desert ecosystem and turned it into a code name for weapons that would contaminate that same environment. This naming approach served as diplomatic cover that disguised environmental harm. By choosing a seemingly innocent animal name, France made their nuclear testing sound less dangerous and more scientific. The pleasant-sounding code name helped hide the serious risks these tests posed to local populations and the environment. Colonial powers often used language to disguise harmful actions, and the cute animal code name masked the real consequences of France's nuclear ambitions. The name Gerboise Bleu would soon become associated with destruction far beyond anything a small desert rodent could cause. When the bomb exploded in 1960, it created radioactive contamination that spread across multiple countries and affected thousands of people. The innocent jerboa became forever linked to one of the most controversial nuclear tests in history. Today, the name serves as a reminder of how governments can use language to minimize the apparent seriousness of dangerous activities. But the cute animal codename couldn't hide what happened when French scientists made a critical miscalculation about their weapon's power. French nuclear engineers spent months carefully calculating the power of their first nuclear bomb. They planned for Gerboise Bleu to have a yield of around 60 kilotons. This was already a substantial amount of explosive power, but the French scientists thought they could manage and control an explosion of that size. They wanted their first test to be successful, but not dangerously out of control. When Gerboise Bleu exploded on February 13, 1960, the bomb produced a yield of 70 kilotons instead of the planned 60. To guarantee success, engineers may have overfilled the core with plutonium, resulting in a yield about 10 kilotons above target. This might not sound like a huge difference, but in nuclear weapons, every extra kiloton matters. The additional explosive power had serious consequences that French planners never expected. The miscalculation happened because French scientists were working mostly alone. Unlike other nuclear programs, France didn't have much help or shared knowledge from other countries. American and British scientists could compare notes and learn from each other's mistakes. Soviet scientists had access to information from their extensive nuclear program, but French researchers had to figure everything out by themselves. French scientists likely put too much plutonium in the bomb's core because they were worried about the embarrassment of a failed nuclear test. If the bomb didn't explode properly, France would look weak on the international stage. So they decided to err on the side of too much power rather than too little. This decision made Gerbois Bleu much more dangerous than they intended. The 70-kiloton explosion made Gerbois Bleu the most powerful first nuclear test in history. The American Trinity test in 1945 had produced about 20 kilotons of explosive power. The Soviet Union's first nuclear test in 1949 reached 22 kilotons. The British Hurricane test in 1952, the shock wave from the explosion traveled farther across the desert than their safety calculations had estimated. These were clear signs that the bomb was more powerful than planned. The explosion was supposed to be substantial, but not this overwhelming. French officials had assured international observers that they had everything under control. They claimed their scientists understood nuclear physics well enough to conduct safe tests. But the stronger-than-expected explosion showed serious gaps in their knowledge. The French nuclear program was more experimental and less predictable than government officials wanted to admit. The accidental extra power meant that radioactive fallout spread much farther than French scientists had calculated. Areas they thought would be safe from contamination ended up receiving dangerous doses of radiation. Communities that were supposed to be outside the danger zone suddenly found themselves in the path of radioactive particles carried by desert winds. France's determination to join the nuclear club led them to make reckless decisions about their first nuclear test. The pressure to succeed created an environment where safety took second place to national prestige. The overpowered bomb became a source of pride for French officials, but it also created immediate dangers that would soon affect the very people France had sent to witness their nuclear triumph. French commanders ordered soldiers to conduct training exercises directly in the contaminated zone around Ground Zero. These weren't emergency rescue missions or urgent military operations. French officers deliberately sent their own troops into radioactive areas as part of planned experiments. The French military wanted to understand how nuclear weapons would affect real combat situations. They needed data about how soldiers would perform on a radioactive battlefield. Instead of using computer models or laboratory tests, they decided to use living human beings as test subjects. French commanders treated their own personnel like laboratory rats in a massive scientific experiment. Veteran accounts documented by ACRO and the Humanité article report soldiers sent within 1 kilometer of Ground Zero without protective gear. Veterans recall no protective suits or dosimeters, just orders to march through the blast zone, with limited washing afterward. The troops weren't told about the serious health risks they faced in the blast area. Military leaders kept information about radiation dangers secret from the soldiers who were actually doing the dangerous work, collected blood samples and medical data from soldiers who had been exposed to radiation. These medical tests were part of the experiment to see how nuclear radiation affected human health. But the doctors classified all this information and never told the soldiers what the test results showed. The troops who risked their health for these experiments never learned what happened to their own medical data. French commanders positioned different military units at varying distances from ground zero. Some soldiers were sent very close to the blast site while others stayed farther away. This created different levels of radiation exposure across the various units. Military planners could then compare health effects between soldiers who received high doses and those who received lower doses of radiation. The French government later claimed that radiation exposure levels were acceptable and well below dangerous annual doses. Officials insisted that safety precautions had been adequate and that soldiers weren't seriously harmed by their exposure. But the government provided no evidence to support these claims and refused to release detailed medical data from the experiments. French military personnel became unwitting victims of their own country's nuclear program. They were used as experimental subjects to help France understand nuclear warfare better. Many of these soldiers developed cancers and other serious health problems in the years that followed. It took decades of legal battles for them to receive recognition that their illnesses were connected to radiation exposure during the nuclear tests. But the French soldiers weren't the only victims of Gerbois Bleu. The radioactive contamination from that single explosion would spread far beyond the immediate blast zone, affecting communities across multiple countries in ways that French officials never anticipated. The radioactive fallout from Gerbois Bleu didn't stop at the borders French officials had marked on their maps. Radioactive particles traveled across hundreds of kilometers of African territory, reaching countries that had nothing to do with France's nuclear program. Wind patterns carried contaminated dust and particles far beyond the Sahara Desert test site. Radioactive materials were detected in Senegal, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, and Sudan. Populations in these countries had no idea they were being exposed to nuclear contamination from a French weapons test. They went about their daily lives while breathing air and drinking water that contained radioactive particles from the explosion hundreds of miles away. Local communities living near the actual test sites began reporting serious health problems in the years following the nuclear tests. Cancer rates increased dramatically in areas around the blast zones. Birth defects became more common among children born after 1960. Respiratory 60 years after the first test, contaminated areas around the test sites remain dangerous today. Scientists can still detect elevated radiation levels in soil and groundwater near the former testing locations. The radioactive materials from the bombs continue to pose health risks to anyone who enters these areas or uses contaminated water sources. The environmental contamination has seriously disrupted traditional ways of life for nomadic communities. Grazing areas that families had used for generations became unsafe for their animals. Water sources that nomadic groups had relied on for centuries now contain dangerous levels of radioactive materials. Many traditional migration routes had to be abandoned because they passed through contaminated zones. In 2006, a French government report by INSERM confirmed connections between the atmospheric nuclear tests and increased thyroid cancer cases starting in 1966. This official acknowledgement supported what affected communities had been saying for decades about the health impacts of the nuclear testing program. France has provided very little compensation or medical assistance to people affected by the nuclear tests. In 2010, France created a law offering compensation to nuclear testing victims, but only one Algerian soldier had received compensation out of 545 total claims approved worldwide by 2021. This extremely low success rate shows how difficult France has made it for victims to receive help. Algerian government officials estimate that over 42,000 people may have been affected by French nuclear testing in their country. However, comprehensive health studies have been difficult to conduct because France has not cooperated fully with research efforts. The French government has been reluctant to share detailed information about the tests or provide access to medical records from the testing period. The fight for justice continues today as new evidence emerges about the long-term impacts of the nuclear tests. Researchers are still discovering the full extent of environmental damage and health effects across multiple African countries. The consequences of this single nuclear test continue to affect multiple generations across an entire continent. Decisions carry human legacies across decades and borders. Understanding this history helps us hold governments accountable for the costs of nuclear ambition beyond the blast zone. If you want to follow the story of the hurricane, check out our video here.